Well, once again, good morning, man. It's been such a good morning just being here and getting to worship the Lord. I hope you've had a great time where you are. We're starting a new series today called Love is the Reason. And the reason we're doing that, we kind of took a shift with everything going on in the world. We've actually just made kind of a little pivot for the next 4 weeks. And I think it makes sense why, right? I mean, when things change in our world, when things change in our life, when there's major shifts that happen, the natural thing is when things get kind of shaken away, you're left with what really matters. You're left to ask and assess, okay, well, are the things that are going on in my life, the normal routines and patterns, the things that stress us out, the things that you think are important, all of a sudden, some things are not quite as important. All of a sudden, some responsibilities that you once thought were really important, they're not quite as important. At one point, some relationships that you maybe had some problems, now you kind of reassess and give some attention to those things in new, impressing ways. Every time we go through something in our life that is a major shift, it's just a natural inclination for us just to reassess and to look at some things. And when that happens, there's some things that it leads us to, and I would say that it leads us to one primary truth. The primary truth that we're going to talk about today is what remains is what matters. Whatever is left after the shakeout, when everything is the normal stuff of life is removed and you're left with whatever you're left with, and that's what really matters to you. That's what's really important. Now, a lot of us, when we look at church, we're asking the same question. I'm standing here today and I'm actually talking to you to pretty much an empty room. I mean, there's some people helping do the cameras and the sound and pulling everything off. And we've had a fair amount of people in here, but with the whole social distancing thing, obviously you're pretty far away. And so for me, I'm standing here and I'm like, I'm looking at an empty room and I'm talking to you through a camera lens and hoping you're seeing me on the other side. And it leads me to ask a question from a pastor, as a pastor and just as an individual, somebody that would be a person of faith. I'm just like, wait, what is church? I mean, what is this whole thing about? I'm asking these significant questions. And if you're watching today, perhaps, and maybe you're like, man, I don't really even like church. You just kind of stumbled across this, or maybe somebody invited you to check it out, and you're checking out, and you're a little bit kind of hesitant even from a distance. Like you would never probably walk in the building, but now you're kind of at a distance, but you're still a little bit apprehensive about this whole God business and about the Bible and maybe even church itself. And I probably know why. Matter of fact, I would say if you are apprehensive and you maybe even have some negative feelings toward the church, probably I've got some of those same negative feelings. Matter of fact, I think I can probably isolate two primary ones that I see, and actually two that I feel a lot of times. A lot of times people look at the church, and one of the primary problems they face with it is something we just simply call legalism. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. It's when you look at the church and you would probably say, well, the church is just really just a sum total of do's and don'ts. It's just a list of things to do. It's typically things that encroach on your normal life. There's new responsibilities, things that you're not supposed to partake in or things you're supposed to partake in and do. And the people that actually tell you that oftentimes are not necessarily people you trust or respect. They're people that you doubt their authenticity at times. And that's come through a long list of things that have happened in our world. And you've seen some reports, or maybe you've had a personal interaction, and you just can't imagine, like, okay, well, why would somebody even do this whole church business? I mean, it just seems like a lot of legalism. It just seems like a lot of rules. But I say there's also another group. And I see this as well, and I feel this as well. And if you're not on the legalism side, you probably swing the pendulum the other way. And I would say the other problem is what I would call license. License is basically just, okay, well, I don't like the rules, and so I'm just going to go where there's not any rules. I'm just going to throw the rules away. I'm just going to live my life to the fullest, whatever I want. I'm going to go after. I'm going to follow my desires. I'm going to follow whatever is in front of me. I'm just going to do whatever makes me feel good. I'm going to go after these things. And, a lot of people take that route. And you would say maybe in your life that that's exactly why you don't like church. And the reason I would say that is because you probably know some church people. Some church people they're not legalists, they're actually licensed people. They say one thing, but they do a whole lot of other things. I mean, they do a lot of things that maybe even you wouldn't do. You would probably even measure yourself against them and you'd say, well, I think I actually live a better life than they live. I don't think I do the things that they do. And so you look at the church and you got some legalists that kind of prohibit you from coming. And then maybe there's also some people that you would look at and go, man, they just live lives of license and they do things that I wouldn't even do, and they go to church. And from that, then you land in one of two places. You either become really disgusted or you're exhausted with the whole thing. You're like, man, what in the world is that whole thing about? And I would say that if you're a church person, you wrestle with that as well. And this is what I see with church people all the time. If you would call yourself a Christian, a follower of Christ, somebody that's a person of faith, you probably oscillate or toggle between these two things. There's probably a time in your life where you've got a pattern, you're going to bear down, and you're really going to do it this time. I mean, you're going to stop doing the bad stuff, you're going to start doing the good stuff. And so you get on a pattern, you get on a routine, you get on a new rhythm, and you go after it. And there's a period of weeks, months, maybe even a few years where you're just really serious about this whole God business. You're really serious about this whole faith business. But then what you find is that maybe through a few small decisions or maybe one big bad weekend or a bad decision, you swing the pendulum the other way and you move to license. And after a few weeks, maybe a few months of that, you got just enough legalism in you to feel guilty. And you know there's something in you know that you need to swing back the other way. And so you live on this roller coaster ride between legalism and license. And at the end of that, what you begin to realize is, man, this exhaustion and this discussion that I have with this whole thing, that maybe there's no substance to any of this. Maybe there's no meaning. Maybe none of this faith stuff really matters. But what if there was a third option? What if there was a third way? And what if the third way was the answer to both these ways? What if a life of faith is not really about legalism? And what if it's not really about license? What if it's not a roller coaster ride that gets you disgusted and that makes you exhausted? Because if you're a person that's wrestling with faith in a time, especially like what we have right now, you're gonna have to ask yourself the question, apart from everything else going on, you're gonna have to isolate yourself and ask the question, what really matters? And what I would say is whatever remains in your life is what matters. And so my hope is that with this idea that you would say, well, if that's true, Dan, if that's true, if there's hope for that, then why do I feel like the church is not just for me? And you would ask the question, well, why do I not just feel like it's not for me? Why do I not feel like it's for me, like it's against me? Through years, decades perhaps, of people of the church mishandling the Bible or the church doing things that you don't understand, what if there was a third way that would force you to do one of three things? Reconsider your faith, rethink church altogether, and then the hope would be that you would actually be able to reclaim your story. What if there was one thing that could change all those things and could give you the hope to be able to follow in faith and to have purpose and meaning in life, to live the life that God created for you to live? Well, a guy named the Apostle Paul, he made a revolutionary statement. He made this revolutionary statement about the thing that remained for him. He said this in the book of Galatians chapter 5, is where you'll find it, but he said the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now that word love is the third option. If it's not a life of legalism, and if it's not a life of license, then what if there is a true path, and it's a path of love? This guy, Apostle Paul, he didn't come by this revelation or this revolution easily. He lived a life of legalism for some time. He knew what it was like to try to pound it out, to try to hustle, to try to be the best of the best. This was his story. Matter of fact, he was so zealous about living a legalistic lifestyle that he actually tried to push away the things of God. He was actually trying to do what others try to do. They tried to extinguish this whole church movement altogether. but he had an encounter with a person named Jesus Christ. And that one singular encounter revolutionized his understanding this fight between legalism and license. So he makes this statement in Galatians chapter 5. But what we're going to do is we're going to work out and try to see, how did he get to this? How did he explain how he got to this revelation, and why, when everything was removed, this is what remained for Paul. This is what he said in Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. It says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Now, in the context of this was obviously first century, okay? This is immediately after Christ has died. He's been resurrected. He's ascended. This message of his resurrection is going forth, and it really is a revolution. I mean, people's lives are being changed, and Paul was one of these lives that have been changed. Well, it set him on a course to talk to other people about it and talk about this love revolution, if you will, that he had experienced himself, the thing that had actually changed his understanding of this whole faith business altogether. And that took him in a lot of different places, a lot of different cities. And one of those places was this city called Galatia. And Galatia was a unique city. And if you were to read the whole book, you can kind of pick up on some of the interpersonal dynamics and some of the cultural dynamics. But one thing that you could surely pick up if you read about this city, and if you read this letter from Paul to this group of people, is this was a group of people that were wrestling with that very issue. They were wrestling with this tendency toward legalism. And they were doing that out of apprehension to try to not fall into a lifestyle of license, because they had seen the pain and destruction that had caused. And then they had also seen and experienced the weakness of being able to live this consistent life of legalism. They had become disappointed or prideful in themselves. And so what does he do? He takes this message, this love revolution message, to the city of Galatia, and lives are changed. They get attached to this idea. They actually start to rethink church. They start to reconsider what faith could be, and then they start to reclaim their own stories. And when that happens, when they start to happen it all starts out really good. It starts out really good. And they experience this thing called freedom. Because, man, it's freeing when you move out of legalism and license. I mean, it becomes very freeing to get in that spot where, okay, I'm not trying to live up to a standard and compare myself to a list or compare myself to others. And I'm not over here just kind of my life's in chaos and going crazy, and I just don't have any structure to my life. They found this way, this love revolution way, and that love revolution for them was freedom. But something happened. That message reached them. They believed that message. They knew that when they met this Christ, that Christ's whole purpose was freedom. And I'll just say this, I'm going to stop and say this, that if faith doesn't feel like freedom to you, then it's not biblical faith. It's not true faith. It's not Christian faith. Christian faith should feel as if it brings freedom. And they had experienced that, and they knew what that was, but something happened. Paul left. And when Paul left, they were still in the same old culture they were in, and they had the same old tendencies that they always had. They were being pulled culturally back toward the patterns of life that they had before. They were being pulled out of freedom, and they were moving back to legalism, and they were trying to move away from license. And so in the next few verses, what Paul does is he reminds them that they were created for freedom, that faith should equal freedom. And so he sends an encouragement, but he also gives them a challenge. He says, stand firm then, and don't let yourself again be burdened with this thing called a yoke of slavery. Now, we don't use that word yoke very much anymore. Maybe you grew up on a farm or something like that, and you know what a yoke is, but basically it was something that they would use to tie two oxen together to plow a field or to pull a cart or something like that. And you can imagine, like, you've got two oxen together or two cows together, and they're pulling this cart together, or maybe two mules, and they're pulling this, and they're working together, and they are bound together by something called a yoke. It would basically be a wooden contraption that you would kind of fit around their necks. And as they would pull, they would walk together. And the yoke was designed to do two things. It was designed to control the animal, and it was designed to direct the animal. and it gave them the ability to pull forward. And so a farmer or an owner would put a yoke on the animal, and they would say that we're going to tie you together, and we're going to control you, and we're going to direct you. And so what Paul does is he picks on this common language, and he picks up on this imagery, because this imagery that he refers to wasn't just sequestered to this idea of farm animals. As a matter of fact, there was a connotation in the first century that had been built over time where this idea of having a yoke was basically taking upon a set of teachings. You can imagine what that is, like a set of beliefs. You put those on and they direct you or they control you. In this particular setting in Galatia, they had a specific set of beliefs. From a Jewish context, it would have been, maybe you've heard the word law before, not just like law here, speed limits, but biblical law. It was the law that was kind of the mark of the covenant of God that he had given this group of people, this Jewish group of people, and this was to be the thing that guided, controlled, and directed them. But over time, these words from God that were intended to be good had become restrictions. And they had produced a reality of slavery inside a group of people spiritually. The law was designed actually to bring you to that point, to bring you to the point where the legalism won't work, that the laws can't actually physically or substantively or spiritually change you. They're weakened in a way, but they're also a mirror. But something had happened with this group of people. They had experienced this love revolution. They had rethought these things. They had reconsidered faith. They were reclaiming this story of God for their lives. But over time, the tendencies in them and the culture around them pulled them away from their first love and pulled them back out of freedom and into slavery. And the problem was that they had started to take these teachings back on that had put them in slavery to begin with. Now, I mentioned this was a type of teaching. A rabbi, a teacher, would actually have his own yoke. And if you were a disciple of a rabbi, it would be said that you're going to take his yoke upon you. You're going to take his teachings upon you. You might have heard this language before. Matter of fact, Jesus himself talked about this exhaustion that we all feel when we take upon a yoke, a burden of just legalism or a life of license. Matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 11, he talked about this dilemma that we're all in with this. See if this doesn't resonate with you. You haven't experienced this. Matthew 11, verse 28 says, "Come to me." This is Jesus talking. "Come to me, all you who are weary and you're burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I mean, basically what he's saying is this, is that you're doing it all wrong. You're looking at life all wrong. You're looking at faith all wrong. Like if you're taking on these rules and you're thinking that is the sum total of faith in a relationship with me, then I've come to introduce you to a new way. And Jesus had the authority to do this, because this is what we know about Jesus. Jesus didn't just claim to be a teacher. He wasn't like any other rabbi. A lot of people treat him that way. They treat Jesus as if, he's just a revolutionary, a political figure, a historical figure, a teacher. But Jesus wouldn't really let you get away with that. He actually made some bold claims. Some bold claims like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He would use words like, I am the the eternal covenant God. Jesus claimed to be God. And when he spoke with the authority of God. And so when he said, "Come to me," what was he actually saying? He was saying, hey, come to God. I'm God. Come to me. I know you're exhausted. I know you're disgusted with yourself or you're disgusted with faith. You're tired of this whole thing. But I want you to know, if you will come to me, if you'll come through me, then I'm going to give you rest, because I want you to learn a new way to live, because I'm gentle and I'm going to find rest for your souls. And so take upon a new yoke. Try a new way. I want to introduce to you a new way. And he's going to point us in the way of love. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you're tired, what do you look for? I mean, Man, I've got a recliner at home, okay? When we moved into our new house about 2 years ago, we built a house out where I grew up. And one of the first things we had to do is we had to get some furniture. We had sold all our furniture, and so we had to get some furniture. And so we were actually looking at some furniture, and we were talking to some members of our church that have a furniture store, and we were talking about the options. And I've always been against recliners, okay? I thought they were ugly, like I wanted to look good and all that kind of stuff. But I'm also 46. Okay? And so what does that mean? That means I'm a lot more tired at 46 than I was at 26. I tell my kids all the time, I'm sorry you got the 46-year-old dad, not the 26-year-old dad. At this point, I'm just tired. And when I come home, we were shopping this thing, I want to come home and I want to sit down. And so the person that was showing us these different options, she was saying, well, you can have this chair and it's pretty and it's uncomfortable, or you can have a recliner and you can be comfortable. And Veronica and I did the thing that you do in your 40s. We looked at each other and we say, comfortable. Because when we get home, I tell you what I do. She's got her recliner and I have mine. And we like to read and we like to, type stuff on computers and stuff like that. And we'll kind of find our spot when we're tired. It's like a magnet when we come in. We want to go and sit in those recliners. Why? Because when you're tired and you want to rest, you need a recliner. You need a bed, you need a place to lay down, you need to rest. But what Jesus does is he doesn't say, hey, I know you're tired, take a rest. He says, I want you to take a yoke on you. And what he does is he doesn't give us a place to rest to lay down. He gives us new equipment. Matter of fact, a famous theologian said it this way. This is a quote from him on this subject. He says, a yoke is a work instrument. Thus, when Jesus offers a yoke, he offers what we might think tired workers need the least. We don't need equipment. We need mattresses or a vacation, not a yoke. But Jesus realizes that the most restful gifts he can give the tired is a new way to carry life, a fresh way to bear responsibilities. He goes on to say this, and this is real talk. He says, realism sees that life is a succession of burdens. We cannot get away from them. Thus, instead of offering an escape, Jesus offers equipment. Jesus means that obedience to his Sermon on the Mount, which is where we find his words in Matthew, his yoke will develop us in a balance and a way of carrying life that will give more rest than the way we have been living. And isn't that true? We don't need a place to escape. And that's been what faith has meant for a lot of people. Like, let's just get out of here. I understand the tendency. I understand the tendency when things get hard, man, let's just get out. But we all know that's not a sustainable approach to life. That what God wants for us is to actually be able to lean into life, actually live the life he created us to live with the purpose and the meaning and the power that he wants to give us. And so what does he have to do? He has to furnish equipment for us so that we can actually stay in the story, stand firm in the story that he's given us. And so it's no mistake when Paul, back in Galatians, when he tells people, he says, stand firm and do not let yourself be burdened again with the yoke of slavery. Don't shift back. Don't go back to that way of living, because that is not the way of love. That's the way of legalism and license, but it is not the way of love. But here's the thing. In order to do that, most people just look to two things, okay? They look to two things. And this is where the whole legalism and license, you try to fix it on one level, right? Because you don't want to return back, but there's a pull in all of us to go back, to let ourselves be burdened again. And so what do? We look to a couple things. The first thing we look to is just theology, it's beliefs. And this is where it starts, but this is not where it finishes. And you might think, well, I don't have a theology, Dan. Well, if you believe anything, you have a theology. All theology means is what you believe about God, what you believe to be true about a maker, a creator. What do you believe about that? And so you have a theology, you have a set of beliefs. And so we would say, hey, if you're going to change your life, if you're going to change the approach, then you have to change your beliefs. And I would agree with that statement. And then you would also swing it one more step, and you would say, well, the other thing you have to do is you have to look at your ethics, and which basically ethics is just a fancy word to say your actions. It's what you do. And this is the way we usually operate in faith. We operate between these two realities, between beliefs and actions. But what Jesus introduces in Matthew and what Paul has picked up on, and he's trying to encourage the people to prevent them from swinging back to these old patterns, is he's saying there's a missing element between theology and ethics. There's something that can connect those two things, and it might be where you're struggling. You might have been trying to say, I got to believe all the right things, and you find that when you just focus on belief, you become kind of legalistic sometimes. Or maybe you focus on actions, and you're like, man, I'm going to try to really rein it in and restrict it in. I'm going to try to love people. I'm going to try not to lie. I'm going to try not to cheat. I'm going to try not to steal. I'm going to try not to do all those things, and look at that, go there, do that. But you know that it's not sustainable. And so what does Jesus introduce? He introduces this new equipment, this new manner of living. Matter of fact, the connection point for Jesus between beliefs, which are necessary, and ethics, which are necessary, is a whole new lifestyle. It's a different way to live altogether. When Jesus spoke those words on what was famously called the Sermon on the Mount, what was he actually introducing? He was actually introducing a set of beliefs, a set of ethics, and he was connecting the two with a manner of living, a way to live life differently. Have you ever been frustrated with the way your life is going? Have you ever been frustrated with faith? Have you been frustrated in relationships? And you've tried to change, okay, I believe this to be true, but why is it so hard? I'm going to try to do this. I can't seem to do it. What Jesus does is he introduces the connecting point between the two. And this is the thing that takes time. And this is why he instructs the church, Paul does at Galatians, don't drift back. I want you to focus on your lifestyle. Pastor John Mark Comer, he said it this way: if you want to experience the life of Jesus, you have to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. And so this presents a whole new set of questions, like how should we live life? There is what Paul would call, in a book we've been studying around here over the last few months, Ephesians, where he says, I want you to walk in the way of love. I want you to live a life of love, and the way that Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. And so in this, what John Mark's talking about and what Paul's talking about, what Jesus is talking about, he's saying, listen, yeah, beliefs are important. Yes, ethics and actions are important, but what you're probably missing is a whole new lifestyle. Don't drift back. Here's a new way to live. Here's a way to walk in love. Now, here's how he connects the dots from here. This is what he says back in Galatians chapter 5, verse 2. He says, mark my words. He's pretty excited. He's pretty intense on this. He says, I tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. Now, what's he talking about here? The mark of circumcision for the Jewish people was a part of their law. It was part of that yoke of slavery. It was saying this is what you have to do in order to be right with God. This is the external mark of a relationship with God. And there was this tendency and there was this temptation to say, well, people are telling me that now if I got to have a relationship with God, yeah, Christ is good. I mean, that's good. But why don't I just take a little bit of this old stuff and just kind of cover my bases? And this is the tendency we always do. We start off on the right path, and then what do? We start to pull in these other things, and then we pull in these other things, and before you know it, you don't just start with a few rules, you've got a whole book of rules. And you can't rule yourself into a relationship with God. Matter of fact, Paul would actually say it in the book of Colossians, to another letter to another church. He says that you've heard it said, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And he says they all have the appearance of wisdom, and on some level, it's a smart choice. But the thing they don't have, he would say in Colossians, and to that church, he says they don't have the power to restrain sensual indulgence. They don't have the power to actually change your desires. You're going to have to go deeper than that. How do you do that? You begin to follow the pattern, the lifestyle of Jesus. How did Jesus live his life? How did he interact with God? How did he show us the manner that we were created to actually live so that we could actually walk in love and we can walk in freedom? How did he do that? Don't let yourselves do that. He said, this is a whole new way to live because your tendency is to go back that route one way or the other and to swing between license and legalism. The roller coaster ride of life, trying to figure it out. And what Paul's trying to do is he's trying to connect the dots. He said, there's a different way of life. Now, he says, you got to be careful, because if you want to go that route, and many people do, and many churches, they try to balance and walk this balance beam between these two realities. Well, we're going to try to make sure we got enough rules to keep everybody in check, and we're going to try to hold on, and we're going to talk about the grace of God and the love of God at the same time, and we're going to try to go through life like this. And we try to hold two things in tension as we walk through this balance beam of life. But what does he say? He says, be careful, because if you do that, you're liable to fall off into one side. Why is that? Because if you are going to take one point, then that means that you're trusting in that thing, that law, that legalism to save you. And you're going to be obligated not just to obey one rule, but you better obey every single rule. Because if you don't obey every single rule, then guess what? You've got a real problem. If that is your approach to God, you will never be able to successfully accomplish your goal, to live that kind of life, to find the freedom, to stand firm, to walk in faith, and to walk in love. Matter of fact, he said it's so dire in verse 4 that if you go this route, you who are trying to be justified by the law, that means to be made right with God by the law, that have been alienated from Christ. That means that you've cast Christ aside and you have fallen away from grace. What is grace? Grace is the unmerited favor of God. What separates Christian faith from every other approach to God is simply this, is that every other approach in the world is saying, I've got to get better and I've got to work my way up to appease God. The thing that's beautiful about the Christian belief, I think, is after the frustration, the discussion, and the exhaustion of trying to live that life over and over again, is to see that God actually came to us, that Christ came to us, and he lived the perfect life we couldn't live. Because the reality is that if he doesn't live a perfect life, you're going to have to. And you know enough about you to know that you can't do it. That there's at least been one thing that you haven't followed through on with yourself, with somebody in your life. You've let someone down. Maybe you've made promises to God. You let God down. You know that you can't be perfect. But if you try to fall over into this way, you try to pull back to the place that you started, what does Scripture say? It says, listen, you've cast Christ aside. You've trusted in something else, and you've traded in the grace of God for something completely different. And the danger of that is oftentimes we do that, and we're into that, and we talk about that and teach that, and preachers preach that, and we don't know how we ended up there, but in so many times we've cast the grace of God aside. And how can we have the ability to do that? Well, somebody's got to fulfill that law, right? Somebody's got to do that. It's you or Jesus, right? And so what did Jesus say? Let's go back to Jesus, remember, because we're going to take his yoke upon us. We're going to learn from him. What did he say? He said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law. He wasn't trying to get rid of the law or the prophets. He says, I've come not to abolish it, but to fulfill them. All the things you couldn't fulfill to get to God, Christ was going to fulfill for you. And he said, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually says this. He says, listen, that thing in you that wants to live up to the standard, God put that desire in you because he's created you for holiness and righteousness and goodness. There is something in you drawing you to God. But the frustration level is this, is that you can't get there. And so what does God do? He doesn't just do away with the law. He actually comes and fulfills the law. As a matter of fact, he says, I'm not even going to let one dot of the I or one crossing of the T fall away. I'm going to do it all, and I'm going to accomplish it all for you. And then he made this bold claim, this challenge. Matter of fact, if you skip down to verse 20, he says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. He'll say, listen, unless you surpass what everybody else is trying to do, all these legalistic people that were in Galatia that were saying, hey, you got to do this, you got to do this to be right with God. And they were adding to the gospel of grace. Then what does he say? He said, listen, you're going to have to surpass them. How can you surpass them when you can't even live up to them? And so what does Jesus say? He says, listen, I've come to live up and to fulfill the law on your behalf. Now, this is the pure definition of love. A holy God that doesn't need anything, loves us enough to do what we could not do on our own. And so what do? This is what he told in the Galatian church in Galatians chapter 5. He says, for through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision or uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. There's our sentence. There's our theme. Love is the reason. This is what it's all about. He says, out of all this stuff, the circumcision doesn't matter, the uncircumcision doesn't matter. I want you to focus on one thing. This is the only thing. When you shake it all down, what remains is what matters. And Paul would say, when I take it all away, this is the thing that matters, is faith expressing itself through love. Now, love in our culture, it means a lot of things. I mean, I tell people I love steak, right? And I do. Like if I go to a restaurant and I'm given a choice and it's a decent restaurant, I'm going to choose steak 9 times out of 10. I love steak. It means I prefer it over other things. But I also I use that for some other things. Like I'll talk about how I love the Chicago Cubs, right? And I love baseball. And I'm kind of having a little problem here because we don't have baseball going on right now. But I love it. And I'm talking about something I enjoy. And I'll use the word love for that. Or I will use it for my wife. And this is somebody I've devoted my life to. I've given her my life. And so I've used this word love to mean something I like, preference in food, a sporting recreation, or a team, and somebody that's the most important person in my life. And it means I can apply that in every one of them. And I think that's because in our culture, we don't have a really good word for love. I can remember 6th grade, and back in the 80s, okay? This is back in the 80s when music was music, or you had songs like, I Want to Know What Love Is, stuff like that. And I can use 80s references now because Stranger Things has helped me out with that. So now they kind of become a little bit more relevant again. My childhood is now kind of coming into my children's childhood. I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. Everybody's looking for this definition of love. But they didn't have the same problem in defining love that we do. We define love like feelings or preferences or even lifetime devotion, but they had a lot more clarity. The word that they use for love simply means this, okay? This is a working definition for us. Love is taking action for the benefit of another. Love is a feeling, but it's not primarily a feeling biblically. Love is actually the inclination, the motivation, the desire, the fortitude to actually implement change and to take action for the benefit of another. That's exactly what we received. Matter of fact, one of the other apostles, the Apostle John, he says this, that we love God. Why? Not because we do it on our own, it's because he first loved us. And so because Christ loved us, the foundation of this is not my performance toward God, not my ability to be perfect so God will approve of me, but it's God's ability to take action on my behalf for my benefit, to do what I needed when I needed it the most, to rescue me from my own sin and my own death. So the foundation for Paul would say, listen, man, let's just throw all this stuff away. Let's shake everything down. Let's move everything out of the building for a second. Let's take everything down to its basis. And what is the basis? Is that we have a message of love for the world. It's the most famous scripture, right? John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him could be saved. Jesus' message was not one of condemnation, it was one of rescue. So why would Paul have a whole other message? Why would the church have a no other message? And why would we try anything else? Why would we go toward the law to hopefully help us to find a sure footing in life? Well, Paul would say, it makes absolutely no sense. Matter of fact, he said, man, you were doing so good. You were running a good race in verse 7. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who called you. That's not from Christ. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. A little sprinkle of the law along with grace actually taints the whole thing. It multiplies and it messes up grace. It redefines what it is. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. He says, I know you would agree with me. And so what does he say? He said, listen, I want you to know, I want you to remember this is what love means. This is the way. So if you're disgusted, if you're exhausted, if you look around and you're like, man, what is all this about? And you're asking questions, then what if you could come back to the one true way? What if you could come back to the only thing that remains after everything else is torn apart? It's God's love for you. And what if that could be the foundation for you that would actually move you out of legalism, and they would actually move you out of a life of license too, and to move you into true liberty, which would be true freedom. How does that work? This is what we'll finish with. Verse 13 in Galatians chapter 5, skip down there. He says this, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. You are called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. So you can see what he's talking about. He said, okay, well, I know your next argument is going to be, well, your next argument is going to be, well, if we've got all this freedom, then we can do everything that we want to do, then doesn't that just mean that grace just covers everything I want to do? And so how does that work? He says, no, freedom doesn't take you away from limits. It actually implements limits that actually help you to live in liberty. You know, limits can help you live in liberty, live in freedom, right? I mean, you do it with your kids. You try to give them parameters. Why? Because you're a loving parent. I mean, you put these things in your own life. Why? Because you love yourself. I'm going to establish some rhythm. I'm going to put some limits in place. Limits are not opposed to liberty. They actually provide for it oftentimes. And so if you could trust a good God that loves you that much, that means that when he puts limits around you, then he's saying, listen, I want you to enjoy the freedom I've given you within the bounds that I've created you to live, the way that I've created you to operate. I mean, you've seen this in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways I see it, not just in my personal life, but just in the world in general, is anytime I go fishing. Anytime I go fishing, we'll pull a fish out of the water. I'll be with my kids, by myself, and you can see that fish from the moment it leaves the water, it is gasping for breath. And what you realize is that with each passing moment, as you're taking the hook out, if you're going to catch and release, you're going to put it back in the water. Why do you do that? Because you want that fish to live. You don't want it to die. Now, you could take it home and you can cook it up and you eat it and all that kind of stuff. And you may need to do that right now because Walmart doesn't have any chicken or whatever, right? But what you typically would do if you're catching and release person, you'll put it back in the water because you see that fish, he's trying to get air because he can't breathe outside the limits of the water. I mean, it's a simple principle. That fish was created to live with limits. And when it steps outside those limits, it just means sure death. It's only a matter of time. And what if the God that loved you created certain limits so that you could truly live in the freedom, the liberty that he wants you to live in? What if he created you to live and to enjoy the love that he has for you and to have relationships that are full of that love and to be able to take that love to the world? And so what does he do? He says, flip it. Don't use your freedom as a time to indulge your flesh and you go like, I can do whatever I want. No, I say, how do I live in this and become the true me, follow the lifestyle of Jesus? And what does Jesus do? He serves other people humbly. That is exactly what God did. That is who we become. Matter of fact, Paul says, I can summarize it for you. All this stuff, I want to summarize it. And the way I want to summarize is the entire law. Everything you're trying to do is fulfilled in keeping one thing. And that's just a lot of things. They had about 613 actual laws that they would try to keep. This was kind of the rule book for them. Do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. He said, listen, I'll give you the cheat code. Here's the cheat code, LOVE. This is one command, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, because if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. What does he say? He says, a bunch of people that are only concerned and consumed with themselves will destroy each other. And you've seen that. It's destructive to yourself. You're anxious, you're worried. It's destructive to your friends and your family. You've had some broken relationships and some places where you've had to reconcile or you haven't reconciled. Why? Because there's something in you when you live for yourself that is a self-defeating prophecy over your life. It destroys you. You see, you weren't created to live for yourself. all those laws that you're trying to keep if you're a legalist and all that license you're going to, what if you channeled that through one thing? What if you channeled it with a new idea? What if you rethought? Church, what if you reconsidered faith? And what if you were to reclaim a bigger and better story? What if you were created for love? That's what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks leading up to Easter. We're going to talk about and unpack what it looks like to live a life of love, to actually embrace who God created us to be and how he created us to live. And so today I want to ask you a couple questions, and this is where we're going to leave it. I want to ask you 2 questions. I want to ask you one as a diagnostic. What does the law require of me? When I say the law, what is the standard required? If you're going to get to God, what's it going to take? It's going to take you being perfect, right? But wrestle it out in your mind. Wrestle with it for a little bit. What would it take? What does the law really require of you? How good do you actually have to be to get God's approval? But then I want to ask you a second question. This is the one that's going to carry us through for the next few weeks. What does love require of me? I want you to jot it down. I want you to think about it. I want you to talk about it with your friends and family. And I want you to really meditate on it, because I think that as we go deeper into understanding of what this love, an action that is for the benefit of another person, if that's the thing that matters, if that's the thing for Paul that remained when everything else was stripped away, then why would we look to a different place? What does love require of me? And my hope is that you would reconsider faith. Even if you would call yourself a person of faith, if you would relook at it and reconsider what it really means. If you're a member of our church, I'm going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you to actually ask the question, what does love require of us? What does it mean for who we are? What does this mean about what we do? When we don't have services and we don't have a building and we're not gathering together, what are we left with? Do we have love? Are we loving the others around us? What does it require of me? And maybe what you'll find is that you've swung toward legalism, or you swung toward license, and you're on the roller coaster ride, and there is a better way, a way of love. What I want to do today is just leave you with that. If you've got made a decision, you need prayer in any way, what I would love for you to do is there's a prayer tab on our website there. You can fill that out. There's a connection card. You can give us some information and ways that we can pray and engage with you. Over the next few weeks, we're going to do this for 2 more weeks at least on Sunday, so we want you to tune back in. Invite people to come back with you as we talk about what it means to reconsider this kind of faith, to rethink what church could be, and to reclaim all of our stories. As we finish up, I want to pray for you, and then I'll let you go about your day. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you, God, that it's true. I thank you for that it's freeing, and I thank you that we have the opportunity now, because of what you've done through grace, to enter into a relationship with you and to live a different kind of life. God, help us to shift the focus, to reconsider and rethink and reclaim our stories around the way of love. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks so much.